So today we come and continue in our series from Jonah, and we come to the second chapter. If you were with us last week, you will remember that we suggested that Jonah is a book full of satire and humor, and that it should cause us to laugh. But if we're willing, our laughter will turn to deep reflection on the very core of who we are, our values and our identity. We're also making sure that we don't get too distracted by the fish or the whale and make it the focus of the story, as many children's storybooks do. The fish is a red herring. It has a walk-on part or a swim-on part, you might say. So Jonah has been on a downward trajectory. He went down to Joppa. He went down into the depths of the ship. He lay down and fell into a deep sleep. And now he finds himself in the depths of the sea. Since the beginning of his rejection of God's call on his life, he distances himself from God, and the consequences of his decision has caused his downfall. So Jonah's life is going downwards, and it won't stop until it reaches rock bottom. And so in the sea, his disillusion turns to despair, and only then does he turn to God. The theologian and author Richard Rohr suggests this: religion is populated by people who are afraid of hell. Spirituality begins when we have been through hell. It's in the belly of the fish that Jonah experiences what you might describe as an encounter with death itself. You might have noticed in verse 2, out of the belly of Sheol I cried. Now the Hebrew word Sheol is used over 60 times in the Old Testament and is translated in a number of ways, including grave or pit, but most simply it's translated as hell. So here in our story, it's true to say that Jonah went to hell and back. So much so that in verse 4, he's been driven from the sight of God. He says, the engulfing waters threatened me. The deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. The roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath barred me in forever. He would struggle to go any lower than this point. This was a death-like experience. He was surrounded, captured. Death has a complete hold on him. And it might be why Jesus chose to pay reference to this story in Matthew 12 to describe his own death. He says this: for just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the sea monster, so for 3 days and 3 nights, the Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth. The author Selwyn Hughes describes his own wilderness experience in his book, My Story, where he tells of a year of his life in his early ministry. And he writes this: what troubled me most was that I had begun to lose my desire for prayer and my appetite for the scriptures. I still read my Bible, but it did not seem to speak to me anymore. I wondered whether I should give up all thoughts of pursuing the ministry. At times, it felt like being in a spiritual wrestling match without knowing who was wrestling with me, God or the devil. Later, he defines this as a wilderness experience. He says it's a prolonged or deep, intense period of trial and testing in which a particular providential purpose was being worked out. Now, so often, if not always, I think this is the pattern of the Christian life. And what we see in the story of Jonah is that the way down turns to be the way back up. So we've got to ask ourselves, was Jonah's trip to the belly of the whale vital in his equipping to be ready to preach God's message in Nineveh? Was his experience of near death and departure from God crucial, in fact, to his ability to be used by God. Now, I think there's a tension here that I think we need to sit with and not just brush over. And it's an uncomfortable one. Does God cause Jonah to be in the belly of the fish? Maybe the question for us, does God cause us to go to those places of darkness and distress? Now, Jonah definitely seems to think so. He says so in his prayer. He says, "You hurled me into the depths, into the heart of the seas." So was God ultimately responsible for Jonah ending up in this whole mess? Is it God's fault that Jonah made bad decisions and ran from God? Well, no, of course not. God's not responsible for Jonah's sin. And just like in the story of Joseph in Genesis, God was not responsible for the actions of Joseph's brothers that caused him to be sold into slavery. But God used that situation to guide Joseph to the most incredible place of responsibility, where through God, he saved a nation from famine. When we go through times of hardship and pain, sometimes it's not our fault, sometimes it is. I don't believe that God orchestrates it, but also I don't think that he is surprised when it happens. He's not kind of caught off guard, and often it gives him the space to work it out redemptively for his purposes, maybe more so than if it hadn't happened. The story could have finished in the fish. Jonah dies. He gets what is coming to him, the consequences of his bad decisions and rejection of God. But there is gospel in this story. When Jonah hits rock bottom and he's swallowed up by the consequences of his silly, foolish, selfish behavior, the God of Israel turns that vehicle of death into this amazing vehicle of grace. In Jonah's desperate desire to distance himself from God, he finds himself in physical and spiritual darkness. But it's in that place that he prays and experiences the mercy of God. One author describes this as severe mercy. And I think that's a good description of what's going on here. Jonah realizes that God is working out severe mercy in his life. You see, often I think we look at life's circumstances, either of ourselves or of others, and we use these as a kind of reliable indicator of how God feels towards us. What Jonah sees is that his circumstances have nothing to do with God's commitment to him. His being in the belly of the fish is not a reliable indicator of God's feelings or commitment to him. And it's that epiphany that caused him to look to God once again. The difference between those who follow Jesus and those who don't is not whether or not they will go through times of challenge, hardship, and difficulty, but it's how they deal with those times when they're in the midst of them. The scholar Tim McKee, who's really involved with the Bible Project, writes this: most of us have this default assumption that we invited God into our lives to give us a smooth passage to our chosen destination, and hopefully with a little comfort and security and safety along the way. What stories like this show us is that if your idea of God is that his greatest priority is to make you safe and comfortable and happy, if you hold up that idea of that's who God is, your whole life experience is going to expose how naive that view of God is. And that's not the God presented to us in the scriptures. In the scriptures, God's highest priority is to call the people to himself and to mold and to shape their character so that they come to understand the truth of who they are as creatures made in the image of their creator, and come to discover the truth that they're not God, and that we make really poor captains of our own ship because we conveniently make the ship sail to wherever is best for us, and even at the expense of others. You may remember a couple of weeks ago that on Stewardship Sunday that Catherine spoke to us about a Jesus-shaped hole in people's lives. Now, the reality is that people, and particularly in a place like Greystones or in more middle-class areas, they don't think they need God. Their life is going pretty good without him. There's no hole there, so why would they need God to fill it? And I know a lot of people out there who are just not convinced that they need Jesus in their lives. And it's likely that we're not going to be able to convince them otherwise. They're sailing towards Tarshish with no hint of a storm. But I believe that it's the role of Christians to continue to be present with these people, because they are going to get to a point in their lives where they enter the storms of life, when they hit rock bottom. And it's in those moments when we stand with them as people of Jesus and point to Jesus. As we draw to a close, I want to offer a few thoughts about prayer, because prayer is a key narrative theme throughout this book. Chapter 2 and most of chapter 4 are prayers, Jonah talking to God. And despite Jonah's many failings, at least he prays. And here in chapter 2, Jonah cries out to God, and God hears his cry. It's in Jonah's most desperate state that he's now ready to speak to God and to hear God speak to him. Remember that even in the midst of the storm, it's the pagan sailors who cried out in prayer. Jonah's prayers at that point are remarkably absent. What's noticeable about Jonah's prayer here in chapter 2 is that every phrase is from the Psalms. This is learnt and taught prayer. Liturgy that has been a part of who he is for many years, and that he now draws on. So often this is the case, that when we are at our lowest point, when we don't know what to say, we draw from prayers, liturgy and song that is learnt. Having grown up going to churches where there is very little liturgy, in more recent years, I've grown to appreciate its need. Liturgy doesn't rely on our emotions being steady, or us feeling right with God, or even whether we actually want to pray. But what liturgy does is it gives us rhythm, structure, and words when we don't know what to pray, and when we ourselves don't have the right words. It gives us structure even when we don't want to pray. Those who've sat with family or friends who are close to death can probably speak of having experienced this firsthand. It's often prayers learnt and remembered, sometimes even from childhood, that people draw on to cry out to God. But Jonah's prayer is also a prayer of remembrance. He is still in the belly of the fish. He hasn't escaped. He's still in that place of death. But suddenly he remembers, and as he does so, he gives thanks. Jonah's whole perspective changes, and he now looks to the source of all hope in the midst of the hopelessness, the one who can redeem and restore him in his place of despair. He gives a shout of grateful praise. Today is Remembrance Sunday, and it is a day when we remember and give thanks for those who gave their lives in war, and particularly the two great wars of the first half of the 20th century. The connections then to this passage are evident. In our remembrance, we look back to mourn, but also to give thanks, to see how God was at work. But remembering should also help us not to make the same mistakes again. However, when we look at the world, we can see that it is still very broken, And as humans, we continue to make the same mistakes. As Christians, our role is, in the midst of our continued failure and the failure of humans, to point ourselves and others to Jesus, to say life is hard, but God is good. We've messed up, but God is full of mercy. So how do you respond when life hits rock bottom? Who do you turn to? And how do you support others who are maybe in that place? As a community of God's people at St. Gabriel's, may we point to Jesus. May we demonstrate that God is not distant in the depths of human experience. Instead, he is there, present, and ready to bring us back out and make us new. Amen.